Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Gary Parker. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the what am I? I'm the Associate Dean for External Affairs here at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis, where I also have the great privilege of serving as the inaugural director of the Clark Fox Policy Institute. And welcome to Open Classroom. This is the Brown School's digital forum for learning that has served as a community colloquium on pressing national and global issues. And this series is the power of macro social work, forging pathways. It's a webinar series that has been produced by the leading macro social work organizations. So I want to thank Influencing Social Policy. I want to thank the Association for Community Organizing and Social Action. I want to thank the Clark Fox Policy Institute, the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy, the Social Justice Initiative, and the Special Commission to Advance Macro Practice in Social Work, and Voting is Social Work. Before we get into today's program, I want to let you know that we have a program coming up, the last in our series, on Thursday, November 17th. Social Work Responds to the Election. And that'll be moderated by Charles Lewis, who is the president of the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy. We don't know what the response will be yet because we don't know what the election results will be, but I know that it will be a really passionate, engaging discussion, and I hope you can join us. I will put a link in the chat where you can register for that event. One last thing, your cameras and microphones are disabled, but we want to hear from you. So please use the chat feature, send us messages, send us comments, send us questions. I've often seen people send links to resources that may be relevant to the conversation we're having today. So please don't hold back. And today we have an exceptional program from all of our friends within the movement of Voting is Social Work. Researchers speak out. And for that, I want to hand this over to my friend and a colleague who I have incredible respect for, Jason Ostrander, who is the Assistant Professor of Social Work at Sacred Heart University. Jason, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for supporting this panel today through Open Classroom. I also want to thank my co-organizer, Mimi Abramovitz. We were just discussing how about a year ago we started putting this together, and we're so happy to have the panelists that we do. For today's panel, there are going to be 5 presentations, and I'm just going to give you a little information about each of the presentations, and each presentation has 12 minutes to talk about their topic, and we have reserved time at the end to answer any of your questions. So if you can please hold them until the end, that would be great. Kicking off our program today is Dr. Mimi Abramovitz. Her presentation is titled Threats to Democracy. Mimi was the Bertha Capen Reynolds Professor of Social Policy, Emerita at the Silberman School of Hunter, Cooney, and co-chair of Voting is Social Work. She is clearly involved in lots of organizations. Some of them include Voting is Social Work, Influencing Social Policy, ACOSA, the Special Commission, and the Social Welfare History Group. Our second presenter today is Gena. Gena Powers. She is presenting on, her title is Voter Engagement in Clinical Social Work, Bridging the Micro and Macro Divide. Gena is a doctoral candidate at UConn School of Social Work and is a member of the California Youth Transition to Adult Study and the Nancy A. Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work research team. Her research focuses on social workers engaging their clients in micro, meso, and macro level decisions. She's also engaged in the Humphreys Institute broadly, as well as the Social Welfare History Group. Our third panelist today is Dr. Gena Gunn McClendon. Her title of her presentation is Empowering Democracy and Research, Infrastructure, Process, and Access to the Ballot Box. Dr. McClendon is the Associate Director of the Voter Access and Engagement and co-director of the Financial Capability and Asset Building Initiative at the Center for Social Development at the Washington University in St. Louis. Her research focuses on advancing policy strategies and research that support voting rights and asset building. She earned her PhD in higher education from Jackson State University. Back to Gary. Gary Parker is going to be presenting on corporal and cognizant barriers to voting, the impact of COVID-19 on the 2020 election season in St. Louis. Gary has spent more than 2 decades engaging in policy practice. As he said, he is the Associate Dean for External Affairs and the Director of the Clark Policy Institute at WashU. He leads a programmatic agenda driven by a commitment to advance social and economic justice for children and adults who care for them. Through the Institute, he leverages a vast network of transdisciplinary scholarship and community knowledge to inform pressing policy issues. Gary, I don't know how soon, but soon will be Dr. Parker, as he's finishing up right now. And Gary's involved in several macro organizations. As he said, he's director of the Clark Fox Policy Institute, and he's on the board of directors of ISP. Tying up everything that we're talking about today will be Dr. Addy Sandler and Dr. Shannon Lane. Their presentation is titled Voting and Motivation. Dr. Sandler is an assistant professor, researcher, and social worker with a background in community counseling and political social work. She currently works in the Department of Social Work at Marist College. She is currently involved in influencing social policy, as well as the National Social Work Voter Mobilization campaign team. Dr. Shannon Lane is a political social worker, known vastly and widely by all of us, a former US Senate staffer to at least Senator Daschle, among others, and author of Political Social Work, Using Power to Make Social Change and Social Welfare Policy in the Changing World. She is Associate Professor and Associate Director of Research in the PhD program at the, I'm going to say this wrong, Wurzweiler? Oh, I did it, Wurzweiler School of Social Work at Yeshiva University. She is also heavily involved in influencing social policy, as well as Macro United Planning Committee. And both Addie and Shannon are very engaged in the Nancy A. Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work. So I am so excited to have everybody here. Mimi, I'm going to let you kick us off, talking about the threats of the democracy, really showing us the big picture of what's going on in the country, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome to all the over 100 people in the room today so far, which is very exciting, and to my colleagues who are all engaged in one form of voter mobilization work, both as scholars and as activists. So I'm proud to be part of this panel. Next. So what does voting as social work do? Well, we engage and mobilize social workers, obviously, students, faculty, agency practitioners, and the community to register people to vote and increasingly to get out the vote. We ensure that people get to the polls, cast their votes, especially those targeted by voter suppression. And we promote ongoing civic engagement in social work education, social service agencies, and the community. We've been around since about 2016. We're nonpartisan, and I see that my co-chair, Terry Mizrahi, is in the audience. Next. So as co-chair of Voting as Social Work, I've been asking myself the following question, literally for months. How has voter suppression, election subversion, and false claims of voter fraud affected our democratic institutions? And recently, it seems that I am not alone. In late August, threats to democracy became the #1 issue facing America, topping cost of living. I think it was in a Pew opinion poll. As the co-chair of Voting as Social Work, I also spend much of my time trying to make sure that voting is social work. So because voting rights and democracy go hand in hand, I want to step back a bit today to reflect on the current attack on US democracy. Next. Remember that democracy cannot be taken for granted. Next. Second, voting is the most basic right in our democracy, but it was not easy to get here. Next. Social movements, as many of you know, played a key role. I'm kind of a history buff, and history tells us that since 1900, the victories of the suffrage, labor, and civil rights movement increased access to the ballot for women, workers, and persons of colors. And here are pictures of a women's suffrage office in Ohio in the early 1900s, one of the many civil rights marches for voting rights and other civil rights. And the last one is Lyndon B. Johnson shaking the hands of Martin Luther King as he signed the National Voting Rights Act of 1965. Thanks. Next. Finally, the third reflection is about the role of systemic racism. We cannot assume that the US was a well-functioning democracy before the Capitol insurrection. History reveals a troubling pattern. Each expansion of voting rights threatened white supremacy, male domination, and class power, and immediately came under attack by those seeking to maintain a status quo. If I had more time, I would actually show you the historical accounts, but we'll save that for another time. Next. Sadly, the right to vote is still under attack today. Next. First is voter suppression, which is intentionally designed to demoralize the electorate. It suggests that the system is rigged, makes people believe that voting does not matter, makes people think their vote does not count. To date, lawmakers in 39 states, 39, have considered at least 393 restrictive bills, up from 75 bills in 24 states in last year. They are not fooling around, as you know if you follow the news. Next. And here's a list of the 15 ongoing voter suppression laws. Take a look. Some of them are in your state, some of them aren't. Some of your states have many, some have a few, but this is just a catalog, FYI. Next. Then there's election subversion. Next. This intentionally interferes with the administration of elections and overrides the will of the voters by replacing existing election administrators with highly partisan officials, substituting preferred candidates for those the voters choose, criminalizing the election certification process, and damaging the legitimacy of and trust in the government and the democratic process. This issue about substituting electoral college representatives and so on is very much in the news today and under deep investigation. As of April, 33 states considered 229 bills to subvert, overturn, or undermine the elections and otherwise override the will of the voters, up from 148 in last year. As I said, they are not fooling around. Next. Gerrymandering we're more familiar with. And since the 2020 census, the states have redrawn their district lines. And based on racially gerrymandered maps, many of the new districts systematically disenfranchise Black and Latina voters. Along the way, the Supreme Court has eviscerated the Voting Rights Act, not to mention abortion, gun safety, and many, many other rights are on the chopping block. Next. What is the impact of this? First, most important, fewer persons of color get to vote. In 2020, there was a record turnout, the largest in 120 years. Yet, 71% of white persons, but only 58% of persons of color voted. The racial gap will worsen with these new restrictive voting laws. Next. On January 6th, we witnessed an attempted coup. An insurrectionist mob falsely claimed that the election was stolen. It stormed the Capitol to stop Congress from counting the Electoral College votes. Very famous picture. Next. And we were warned. In a book called How Democracies Die, two political scientists identify 4 warning signs of democracies in trouble. They include rejecting the democratic norms or rules of the game, denying the legitimacy of political opponents, curtailing opponents' civil liberties, especially the media, tolerating or encouraging violence. Each one of these has 4 subcategories, which we don't have time to look at now, but nearly all of these signs are evident in the United States today. So the authors, who you see on television a lot these days, conclude democracy does not necessarily end with a bang, a violent military revolution, or by a coup. Rather, it ends with a whimper. That is the slow, steady weakening of critical institutions, the vote, the press, the courts, and so on. Next. Even President Biden declared the long-standing guardrails of US democracy have been shaken. They have placed a dagger at the throat of democracy. And you can see the 2 times that he's already said this in public speeches. Next. But it is not just the vote. Next. Other institutions are under attack. We are banning books. 39 states have introduced more than 150 bills to ban more than 1,000 books on any topic that might make students uncomfortable. Quote, the press is less independent. The number of daily newspapers are down 28%. Investigative reporters down 50%. Meanwhile, the large media corporations, including some of our favorite shows, own 80% of the daily newspapers and the other media. Less trust in government. In 1960, 3/4 of the Americans trusted the federal government, always or most of the time. Today, it's 20%, an all-time low. Next. And democracy is in trouble. The Democracy Index, calculated by The Economist, the British journal since 2006, ranks 167 countries from 0 to 10 based on 5 measures. It places the countries in 1 of 4 categories: a full or flawed democracy, a hybrid or authoritarian regime. And the US sits between democracy and authoritarianism. It includes, because of the rankings that you see there highlighted in yellow, we fell from a full democracy in 2006 and increasingly flawed up to 2022. And if you look on the other side, compared to other countries, the highest democracy score was Norway, and we fall behind Canada and the UK. Not a proud moment. Next. These threats to democracy take place in the context of record high inequality. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis warned, quote, we can have either democracy in this country or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of few, but we cannot have both. And today we have great wealth, record high wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. Next. So what can social workers do? We are good at diagnosing individual and social problems. Yet we, along with many other Americans, are not always ready or comfortable with assessing the status of our democratic institutions, right? So we need to up our game. Next. We can and must up our game. Registering voters and getting people to the ballot is to strengthen democracy. It's the right thing to do. It supports the profession's mission and social justice values. We are in the right place as social workers. We sit at the intersection of the individual and society, where we are very well positioned to witness and address the harms brought by a faltering democracy and bring voter mobilization into the community, civic participation into agencies, and human rights into the United States. Next. But never forget all these bad things that have happened. Never forget that what has been done can be undone. Next. Imagine if all 700,000 social workers in the US registered 3 voters and got them to vote, and they registered 3 more and they also voted, and so on. No need to imagine. Join our Power of 3 registration and get out the vote campaign. Next. You can find information about this on our website, Voting is Social Work. Your vote is your voice. Be heard. Next. Don't mourn, organize. Thank you. I think, Gena, it's up to you. You're next.
Thank you, Mimi. Good afternoon, everyone. My presentation is based on the nonpartisan voter engagement work that my colleagues and I do through the Nancy A. Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work at the University of Connecticut. We've developed a model of voter engagement trainings for schools of social work. I'll provide an overview of that training and present some key findings from the evaluations of our model. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge the land that each of us are joining from today. Where I'm located in Maine, I am on the traditional territory of the Wabanaki Confederacy. I'd like us all to take a few moments to remember the indigenous lives, land, and cultures that have been stolen by colonizers, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. I would also like to recognize and honor the current tribes who are still here and demanding justice for their people and their lands. As it relates to voting and voter engagement, most people are unaware of the barriers that Native Americans overcame to have the right to vote. We all know that voting in our country began with only white men who own land, which then broadened to include all white men. As we all know, the 15th Amendment gave suffrage to some Black men in 1870, though many African Americans continued to be disenfranchised through literacy tests and poll taxes. We're also familiar with the 19th Amendment, which gave women suffrage in 1920. What most of us aren't taught in school, though, is that Native Americans weren't guaranteed the right to vote in every state until 1962. Native Americans still disproportionately experience barriers to voting today, including felony disenfranchisement, voter ID laws, and polling locations. However, we saw record numbers of Native American voters in 2020 as the community organized to overcome the structural barriers to voting. This has had huge impacts on elections and subsequent laws. I'll use the National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics, particularly the value of social justice, to frame voter engagement. In order to alleviate the social issues that our clients face, such as poverty and discrimination, social workers connect our clients to resources and opportunities. However, there are systemic barriers to these resources, or these opportunities simply do not exist. So in order for clients to have access, there are micro and macro interventions to promote social justice. The Code of Ethics also states that our clients should be encouraged to participate in the decision-making processes related to these social change efforts. Voting and engaging our clients in the voting process is one way that social workers can uphold our professional value of social justice. However, there are structural barriers to clinical social workers advocating for policy change. For example, they are often overworked and underpaid. There is not enough time in the day for the ever-increasing caseloads. That is why it's important that we are aware of the methods of policy advocacy that take very little time but can have a huge payoff, such as voter engagement. I'm going to give an overview of the what, why, and how of nonpartisan voter engagement before discussing the Institute for Political Social Work's evaluation findings. The information included in this overview comes from our voter engagement trainings for social work students, faculty, and practitioners. Voter engagement in general involves supporting others with everything they need to cast their ballot, including voter registration, education, and access. Helping someone with voter registration includes connecting them with the information and resources needed to figure out if they are registered at their current address, and if not, how to do this. Voter engagement also entails educating them about when, where, and how to vote in the next election. Voter education also includes informing them whether or not they're eligible to vote. Lastly, voter engagement relies on ensuring everyone has access to cast their ballot. There are two types of voter engagement, partisan and nonpartisan. Nonpartisan voter engagement means that social workers do not recommend who their clients should vote for, but simply encourage them to exercise their voice. Many social workers are unaware that nonpartisan voter engagement within their agencies is ethical and legal. It is legal for nearly all agencies that employ social workers, including government agencies and nonprofit organizations. In fact, it is illegal for some agencies to not practice voter engagement. The National Voter Registration Act of 1993, which was led by social workers, legally requires certain government agencies to help clientele with voter registration. This includes offices of public assistance, disability services, departments of motor vehicles, and libraries. Engaging our clients in voting is also ethical. Voter engagement includes many of the same skills as any other clinical social work practice, and it is empowering and beneficial to the clients and communities we serve. And this all ties into why voter engagement is important to social work practice. First, voting rules and processes are designed to be complicated and restrictive. For example, it is not particularly easy to know when, where, and how to vote. Felony disenfranchisement laws differ by state, and people often assume that they've permanently lost their right to vote if convicted. Some people, such as those in nursing homes or hospitals, may not have physical access to a ballot box, and many people believe that their vote won't make a difference in the election's outcome. However, elections can be decided by a small number of votes. Candidates in some states, such as Virginia in 2017, can win by the difference of a single vote. And in 2015, when 2 Mississippi candidates got the same number of votes, do you know what they did to break the tie? Per Mississippi state law, the candidates drew straws to determine the winner. We also see close races in US Congress and presidential elections, with candidates winning by fractions of 1% of the voting population. The second reason that voter engagement is important to our social work practice is that these structural barriers particularly impact certain populations that are historically disadvantaged, populations that social workers tend to work with. By social workers providing their clients with resources about voting rights, opportunities, and processes, oppressed communities' barriers to voting are reduced. And lastly, voter engagement is important because politicians give more attention and resources to communities that vote, which can lead to improved health for these communities. In terms of how we do voter engagement, we can partner with organizations such as state chapters of the League of Women Voters or the local Registrar of Voters. Some concrete examples of how social workers engage their clients in voting include a food pantry that partnered with a nonpartisan voter engagement organization to set up a voter registration drive for several weeks before the election. Voter engagement organizations might have free pins that you can wear to let clients know that they can ask you for help, similar to the LGBTQ+ pins that we might wear to let our clients know we are allies. Printed information can be publicly displayed, such as homeless shelters posting signs stating that clients have a right to vote, may register to vote there, and may use the organization's mailing address when registering to vote. The National Coalition for the Homeless also recommends that agencies update their intake forms and procedures to include questions about voting, such as asking whether the person has moved, changed names, or been arrested. Cheryl Aguilar, founding director and lead therapist at Hope Center for Wellness, wasn't able to make it today, but I did want to highlight her NASW article. She explains that, as with any other interaction we have with clients and communities, nonpartisan voter engagement is a balance of various responsibilities. It's important to be aware of the power dynamics and respect people's choices. As a social worker, our role in nonpartisan voter engagement is to ask questions and offer information and resources. It's important to be aware that some people have very valid reasons for not wanting to vote. Communities who have been historically marginalized by our country's political process may not want to participate in elections. Other people may have barriers to voting that they may not want to disclose, such as barriers related to felony convictions, surviving intimate partner violence, experiencing homelessness, or not being US citizens. The voter engagement model that my colleagues and I have developed involves infusing nonpartisan voter engagement into schools of social work. It includes trainings of social work students, faculty, and field supervisors on the what, why, and how of voter engagement. These trainings are done in partnership with the university's local nonpartisan voter engagement experts. We've evaluated our overall voter engagement model as well as specific aspects of the model. Evaluations of our voter engagement trainings use quantitative data from surveys of students and field supervisors, as well as qualitative data from students' written course assignments. Each of our studies show the benefits of training social work students and practitioners in voter engagement. Evaluation of our voter engagement model demonstrates the impact that social work education can have on students' own voting behavior, as well as the engagement and empowerment of their future clients. Analyzing pre and post tests from 475 students at 2 universities over 3 years, this study found significant increases in students' perceived importance of voting to their social work practice, their likelihood of voting in future elections, and the likelihood they will engage others in voting in the future. My colleagues and I have also evaluated classroom-based voter engagement projects as a component of the voter engagement model. For example, we use mixed methods to evaluate the use of a group project used at 2 universities where students tailor their voter engagement activities to a specific target population. We found students to increase their voter registration rates and their likelihood of voting in future elections. For example, one student in Minnesota wrote, "I had regretfully never voted before coming into class. I also was convinced that I had quote unquote registered wrong, and thus was afraid to even try and vote. Basically, I had a lot of unanswered questions and preconceived notions about what registration and voting entailed." Students' perceptions of voter engagement being relevant and important to social work practice also increased. For example, reflecting on her experiences with voter registration at a homeless shelter, one student explained, "On election day, there was a young woman who we helped register to vote for the first time. She came out after and greeted us with high fives. She told us about how important voting was to her because her grandmother has always voted, and it was a dream of hers to vote just like her grandmother had. It's people like her that remind us what voting can do for our clients." Our model also heavily relies on incorporating voter engagement into students' field education, including training field supervisors. We use pre and post tests to evaluate the training of 120 field supervisors at 2 universities in 2016 and 2017. We found that while participants continued to perceive barriers to implementing voter engagement in their agencies, they rated voter engagement as being more important after the training, and they were more likely to plan to incorporate voter engagement into their work with students moving forward. By also training field supervisors on the what, why, and how of voter engagement as part of our model, students were able to get a much deeper learning of voting and voter engagement. Our nonpartisan voter engagement trainings equip students and field supervisors to create a culture of voting in their practice settings. This is a promising educational intervention model for increasing the voter turnout among social workers and their clients. Ultimately, the voter engagement model aims to increase our clients' political power, challenge the status quo, and achieve social justice. If you're interested in learning more about how you can incorporate voter engagement into your own practice or curriculum, here are some additional resources, including my contact information, and these slides will also be available on the Open Classroom website. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Addie and Shannon.
No, actually, I think we're turning it over to Gena.
Oh.
That's okay. Gena, are you there? If not, we can have Gary go next.
Nope, I'm here.
Okay, great.
Yeah, sometimes that thing kind of does something crazy. But anyway, I'm Gena, I'm McClendon, and let me share my screen because I don't think I did that yet. Is it shared correctly? Somebody help me out.
It is.
Okay. So I work in the Brown School, the School of Social Work, but specifically at the Center for Social Development, where we have spent the entire time that the center's been open in terms of research and inquiry, innovation, and impact, and specifically around financial capability and asset building. But in 2018, I volunteered at a Paul Place in 2008, intentionally working in the community with a high concentration of Blacks. And I'm telling you this because, I think everybody on this webinar has some passion somewhere that made you want to even do this work. But that particular day, I witnessed many failures and shortages of paper ballots, broken and faulty equipment, the lack of proper assistance for people with disabilities. Unfortunately, the list goes on, long lines and extended wait times. I thought that these were typical occurrences on election day, something that happens at every polling place because systems fail, procedures fail, right? And things just happen. But I also saw the excitement in the eyes of hundreds of voters, first-time voters, were eager to help make history by voting for a Black man for president. And let me just say, the poll place where I went that day was like 90%, that area was 90% Black. I was excited to see all these people, young people, particularly young Black males. As I passed out water and chatted with voters waiting in line, I thanked them for coming because people like to feel appreciated. I began to ask questions like, is this your first time voting? Most of them, especially young people, said yes. My follow-up question was, why are you voting? And the common response was that Barack Obama would be the first Black president, and the voters wanted to help be part of history. So my final question was, are you familiar with the other electoral races and ballot initiatives? And most said, no, I'm only here to vote for the president. That last response would haunt me for years. You see, I know how to research candidates and grew up in a culture of voting, but I've always known that others did not have what I was taught. I wanted to understand the reasons for this response. Why do voters feel so disconnected from the other concerns on the ballot? In all honesty, it's not that I didn't get it, but I wondered what would make a person become a lifetime voter. What would it take to create a culture of voting in Black communities? As the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative was developed in 2017, I often have thought about how that work might help people to connect their real life issues to voting. If people can't connect voting to their daily lives, if they don't think that voting matters or that they matter, it will always be difficult to maintain a healthy and strong democracy. It's not enough to tell people that casting a ballot on election day is a fundamental right all eligible voters of all eligible voters. More is needed. And so that's what the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative, VAE initiative, grew from this realization. So, and I want to be intentional in helping you understand that, especially social workers, that how important it is to understand that race matters. Racism is in everything we do, from housing to home ownership, to financially being stable, to all kinds of things. And then, and of course, voting. So, the VAE initiative, again, looked at democracy in crisis and found, just noticed that it's rooted in racism. And some of this has already been said, that Mimi said that, so state rights have been about white supremacy, increasing restrictions to the right to vote, a surge in voter suppression legislation targeted toward Blacks and people of color, that this and misinformation about the electoral process and outcomes amplified by social media, a surge in anti-protest laws, and the list goes on. But what I want you to notice in these two pictures, one of these pictures is at the Pettus Bridge, when they did that walk in the 60s. The other one is a more recent picture in 2019, I think, something like that. But the point is, nothing's changed. That's what I want you to recognize. It's the same thing. I had a video that I wanted to show, but I don't think the sound's going to work properly, so I'm going to skip it. But what it was intended to do was show you what's at stake. And I think the panelists before me made that point. So I'm going to take this from a different perspective, kind of hone it down to the Missouri context and how this research began. So one of the things when I first started doing this was to look at voter right things around voting, not just voting, but then what organizations were involved and engaged and how do we increase engagement. But looking specifically at Missouri, the voter ID has been proposed 13 times. The first was proposed in, we were the first state, we're always the first and stuff like this, to propose voter ID in 2002. It passed in 2006. The Missouri Supreme Court found after a lawsuit that a heavy and substantial burden of Missourians free exercise of the right of suffrage that was in the Constitution. It was a violation of the Missouri Constitution. Then voter ID passed again in 2016 with over 60% approval of Missouri voters. And the reason why I point that out is because I had a conversation with one of my colleagues. We were talking about this and she was gung-ho about the fact that people needed to have ID. And so I had to explain to her that it's just not that easy. You have one, doesn't make it simple for everybody else. But so anyway, moving forward. So with some injunctions, the law was not enforced for voter ID in 2016, and then again in 2018 and 2020. So HB 1878, a voting bill passed that went into effect August 28, 2022. And so let me just kind of tell you a little bit about this. So what started as a standalone voter ID became an omnibus bill. Photo ID. So it enshrines strict photo ID requirements to vote by removing photo forms of ID Missourians currently relying on to verify their identity at the polls. It has a different impact on voters of color, and low-income voters, seniors, and voters with disabilities are disproportionately impacted. The Missouri Supreme Court has found strict ID requirements unconstitutional. Here's another thing that it did. This isn't a bad thing. So it allows 2 weeks of no excuse absentee voting early, but only for voters casting ballots in person at the election office, not for ballots by mail. Now, there are a couple of lawsuits that are challenging this bill. So if those lawsuits win, then this whole provision goes away. Listen to this. Voter registration. It prohibits anyone outside of the government from being paid for voter registration, impeding organizations whose staff do voter registration in their work. Volunteers would need to register as voter registration solicitors. So you get different organizations like the NAACP, the Urban League, different organizations that will do a voter registration drive at different events, things like that. They're paid people. They can go to jail and lose their voting rights. It also makes it illegal to make an absentee ballot application available to anyone who is not registered. So my next door neighbor is an older person, so I typically help her get an application for an absentee ballot application. I can no longer do that. I could go to jail for that. That could be considered a felony. This bill also allows voter purges. So the Secretary of State can do an audit and order the removal of voters from the rolls at his discretion. It does a few more things, and I don't want to use up my entire time doing this, but it also grants expanded power over legal actions on elections to partisan legislators, allowing legislators to join a case with private counsel who would not answer to the taxpayers of Missouri. So we, as a Missourian, we wouldn't have an opportunity to know what they're doing. It limits disability access and some other things. So we here in Missouri, we've got some issues here that we're trying to deal with. But anyway, we also wanted to look at access to voting on election day. So we're talking about infrastructure. So I want to talk a little bit about the research that we did in 2018, Democracy Rise. And that was a research on voting infrastructure and processes. So what we were interested in learning is, because St. Louis is such a segregated city, how many people, were people able to vote at their discretion or easily in a white neighborhood, higher income, and we did about lower income, if they're able to vote. So, but what we wanted to do is research to inform practice and policy. We wanted inclusive democracy, expanding knowledge of threats and opportunities. We wanted to support for advocacy and engagement to improve the electoral process, engage and train new generation of human service practitioners in voter protection. So that was the goal. So the name of this study was, Will I Be Able to Cast My Ballot? Race, Income, and Voting Access on Election Day, a student-engaged research. So it's a multi-method study of the electoral process and access among registered voters in St. Louis City and County. Data collection on Election Day, November 6, 2018, in St. Louis City and St. Louis County. We recruited graduate researchers from the Brown School, and we had about 40 total that did collection shifts. And it was important to engage the social work students because we're trying to create not only just a culture of voting, but also helping social workers understand their role in voting. And they were all trained prior to election. We also had a great relationship with the Board of Election Officials, where they actually came in and helped us train the student researchers. And we still have a good partnership with them today. So our research questions were, are voting procedures and practices approximately the same in different polling places? Are there barriers in the voting process that may reduce electoral participation? To what extent are race and income related to electoral process and access to voting? And some of our key findings were that fewer election judges or more interference with the free passage to enter the building at polling places in predominantly Black and lower income communities, longer lines and lack of seats for voters, more common at predominantly Black polling places. And one thing I didn't mention is that in Missouri, the only people that are allowed in the poll place are people that are poll workers, and they'll let high school students be in there. So we were able to work out a thing with our Board of Election Officials where our students were allowed to observe inside as well as outside. There was high police presence at polls in high poverty communities, but none in low poverty communities. High poverty locations more likely to have conditions preventing voters from completing their ballots. So fewer poll workers, broken election machines, and the list goes on. So, in conclusion, what we found is that the evidence in the study suggested that voting infrastructure and process are in practice another form of voter suppression. Based on this evidence, we are better prepared to inform and address barriers in electoral process and access. While the voting process will never be perfect, we can and should do more to reduce barriers that systemically disenfranchise voters of color and low-income voters. Mail-in voting and eventually computer-based voting should be a high priority to avoid systematic barriers to in-person voting. So in addition to doing our research, we also work a lot with community partners. Again, when I first started this work, one of the things that I wanted to find out was who was on first, who was on second, who was doing voting. Were there any organizations that were specific to voting? And I found out that no. But what we were, along with our partners, were able to do is create a community of organizations that want to do things around voting. So that included, the research evidence was disseminated and discussed. There were opportunities in election protection and poll volunteering, participation with national organizations to strengthen democracy, organizing webinars and meetings with community groups, meeting and experience with local election officials. And we have done several webinar series, and the last webinar series, we did 4 of them. The last one is on September 28th, where we are talking with our Board of Election Officials, helping them. We want them to help people understand what their rights are in terms of going to vote. And then, of course, we'll also have a national expert that will kind of break down things for us. So in conclusion, I would say that, then we're going to do this research again, and it will be a little bit different, but we'll do it in November. But one of the things that I really, want people to understand about what we do is the importance of social workers being a part of this, because there has to be a line, a generation of people that do it. And then the last thing is to, again, recognize that racism is in every single walk of our lives. And if you don't know that, I would suggest just start with healthcare. Read the 1619 Project book. You can learn more from there. But anyway, thank you. And I want to thank Gary and everybody else for having the opportunity to do my study.
Thank you so very much, Gena. Gary, I believe you are up.
Is everyone seeing the right screen?
I see the right screen.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jason. And thank you, Gena. It's always so wonderful to hear from other local researchers here in the St. Louis region. And I'm going to take just a little bit of a different perspective here.
Gary, I don't see, I just see Gena's screen, Gena's slide is still up on my screen.
Is it? Okay, let me see. How's that?
There you go.
Yes, thank you, Mimi. A lot of us in the social work profession are community organizers. I certainly consider myself a community organizer and learned from some of the best at the Silberman School of Social Work. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about the challenges that Get Out the Vote mobilizers experienced in the midst of the 2020 election season. So we're calling it Corporal and Cognizant Barriers to Voting, the impact of COVID-19 on the 2020 election season. So in 2020, two critically important elections took place in Missouri. And the first was held in August, and it put before the voters an amendment to the Missouri Constitution that would expand Medicaid. At the time, Missouri was only one of 13 states that had not adopted the Affordable Care Act. And the second election in November would determine the next president of the United States. So during the 2020 election season, the country was also in the midst of two pandemics, COVID-19 and racialized violence. And as the number of pandemic-related hospitalizations and fatalities grew, those without health insurance were increasingly vulnerable to medical debt and to bankruptcies. And the COVID-19 pandemic disproportionately affected communities of color and elders, and highlighted the health and economic disparities that are longstanding within those communities. And because of these consequences of the pandemic, there was a heightened awareness of the need for access to affordable health care. Furthermore, increased attention was brought to the movement for racial justice when George Floyd, a Black man in Minneapolis, died when a white law enforcement officer kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. This once again elevated the brutality experienced by Black Americans when interacting with the police. Protest organizers and leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement created protests across the country, and large protests were held despite the potential for the gatherings to become super spreader events. Now, St. Louis has a similar history of racial violence perpetrated by law enforcement. In August 2014, a white police officer fired 12 bullets directed at a Black teenager, and 6 of them hit him. And it was resulting in the death of Michael Brown Jr. Following the deadly shooting, police protests erupted, drawing attention to racial tensions between police and local residents in Ferguson. And the incident sparked a deeper discourse around the history of racism and inequality in St. Louis and the need for transformative policies that would create a more just and equitable society. So after the death of Michael Brown, Ferguson kind of came to symbolize racial strife and inequity in the USA. So as a result of these intertwined pandemics, local community leaders in St. Louis City and St. Louis County emphasized the need for voters, particularly in communities of color, to get engaged in these elections in November and in August as a tool for advancing health and racial equity. But the circumstances around the COVID-19 pandemic in particular created new challenges to connecting with eligible voters and for voters to engage in the electoral process. And these challenges can be divided into two different typologies. The first is corporal, the use of one's physical body and its potential risk. And the second is cognizant, the regulatory proficiency needed to navigate the shifting rules of the voting process. So engaging in the democratic process presents corporal risks, and they're higher within communities of color, because as COVID-19 spread across the USA, communities of color were disproportionately impacted and more likely to contract and die from the disease. And this was the result of generations of social and economic inequities that undermine the health and mental health of populations of color. Furthermore, workers of color tend to be low-wage earners in essential positions that require close proximity to the public, thereby increasing their potential exposure to the virus, and limited access to personal protective equipment compounded by the risk and the data released by a St. Louis Metropolitan Pandemic Task Force demonstrated that although 1/5 of the population of the region was Black, almost 50% of COVID-related mortalities were Black patients. So little is known about how fear of the virus played into the decision-making process of community mobilizers on whether or not they would participate in the election. However, previous research suggests that poor health is related to lower voter turnout. In multiple studies, those with self-rated poor health were consistently less likely to vote than those with excellent health. And while the impact of poor health on voting behavior persists across age groups, the effects of this finding increase with age. So in addition, voters needed the knowledge and the confidence to maneuver through these cognizant challenges of voting, and the pandemic was further complicating the process. So although the US Constitution grants citizens the right to vote, it allows states the ability to regulate the times, the places, and the manners in which elections are being held. And procedural burdens and shifting regulations have historically been created in order to disenfranchise voters, and complicated registration processes, poll taxes, literacy tests, and more have served as barriers, particularly for voters of color. So in a stated effort to reduce the potential exposure of COVID-19, the state of Missouri implemented some temporary changes to the process of voting. The existing law dictated that eligible voters meeting certain criteria were able to request an absentee ballot that could be returned by mail or in person to the Board of Elections. Absentee voters are required to present a government-issued ID, and some, but not all, were required to have their ballots notarized. For example, if you are active military or disabled, you don't need to notarize your ballot. However, if you're incarcerated or out of the election district on election day, you had to get your ballot notarized. And it's important to note that the concern of contracting COVID-19 by voting in person was not a qualifying reason to receive an absentee ballot. So there were limitations to absentee ballots. So in response to these limitations, the state of Missouri passed legislation temporarily allowing for mail-in voting. And the mail-in ballots, all mail-in ballots were required to be notarized. Additionally, mail-in ballots had to be mailed. They could not be dropped off in person. And as a result, there were all of these lawsuits that were filed challenging several parts of the new law. But, despite the confusion caused by the new rules, the legal challenges were unsuccessful and they moved forward. So because we are researchers, we care about social theory. So I want to tell you a little bit about the social theories that were kind of underpinning this particular research project. And there were two. The first is the theory of protection motivation, and the second is the theory of political efficacy. Now, the theory of protection motivation is a really interesting one. It's a cognitive model of behavior that's used to understand the response to a perceived physical threat and describes the challenges of overcoming those physical threats. So the theory consists of four factors: an appraisal of the threat, the perceived vulnerability one feels to the threat, the effectiveness of any kind of risk preventative behavior, and the ability to engage in that risk preventative behavior. And this theory has been applied to studies to understand a lot of decisions in various populations impacted by COVID-19, including healthcare professionals, tourists, consumers, employees in the workplace, vaccine recipients. So organizers engaged in mobilization, as well as the voters, had to evaluate the overall threat of COVID-19, their particular vulnerability to the virus, if there were preventative measures that were effective, and then decide if they had the ability to adhere to those measures. A lot of thinking there. And during the election cycle, community organizers also had to engage in overcoming cognizant challenges of voting. And they did that by increasing the political efficacy of citizens. And now here's the theory of political efficacy. And a lot of folks that have engaged in this work are very familiar with this. And the theory of political efficacy reasons that in order for a citizen to vote, they must have the confidence They must have the confidence that they have a firm understanding of political issues. That's what we call internal political efficacy, and that the government will respond to their vote accordingly, which is what we call external efficacy. So the ultimate goal for Get Out the Vote mobilizers is for citizens to feel they are competent on pressing policy issues and that the government can and will respond to the will of the people. And the interventions they employ are voter education, providing contact with candidates, voter registration drives, all the things that we've heard, but there was, again, as we mentioned, barriers. So quickly going over the setting, the data was collected during the election cycle while the pandemic was going on. The participants had to be those folks that had been engaged in Get Out the Vote efforts, that they are in a decision-making capacity, and that they were mobilizing within poverty-impacted communities in St. Louis City and St. Louis County. We did semi-structured interviews. And I also have to thank Hebrew University and Professor John Gall, who was really mentoring me throughout this project. And I also want to thank Washington University and Vice Provost Mary McKay. And the IRB did sign off on it. So we interviewed 36 subjects. Just take a quick peek at this. I know my time's running out, so I'm going to go quick. The majority of them were female. They were all different kinds of campaigns, ballot initiatives, candidates, nonpartisan voter information, issues and candidates. So now let's talk about these corporal challenges as I scroll down my notes. So there were all kinds of corporal, meaning the physical, the challenges. There were the mandated stay-at-home orders, public events where you used to do petitioning were canceled. So it was very hard to get something on the ballot since you couldn't have folks sign petitions. There were concerns about going door to door, what that meant, knocking on folks' doors, how the folks who were living in those buildings felt being approached by another person during a pandemic. As we mentioned, there was a disproportionate impact to elders who were also election judges, and Gena did a great job talking about the challenge of reducing the number of election judges. A lot of the polling sites were relocated because they were either in senior centers or other places where there were vulnerable populations. And there were also transportation programs that would help get voters to the polls. Those transportation programs were also canceled because they were very nervous about bringing people in their cars. Again, remember, this is early into the pandemic where we didn't have a lot of information. The cognizant challenges, these shifting and complicated rules, and then the lawsuits and the uncertainty of rulings. I have to tell you that I spoke to folks that were engaging in voter mobilization efforts, and a lot of times they're saying, like, we didn't know what the rules were at any particular moment because they were constantly moving around. And then the question, do you notarize or do you not notarize? And having to keep track of who needs to and who doesn't. There was also the issue, if you mailed in your ballot, there was a lot of them that were arriving late. The mail-in ballots had third-class stamps on them and not first-class stamps, so they were delivered a lot slowly. So if you did not mail them in advance long enough for them to be processed, then those ballots were disqualified. And a lot of ballots, whether they weren't signed properly, whether they were mail-in ballots that were dropped off because you weren't allowed to do that, or any of the rules that about the ballots, if you did not adhere to all of them, your ballot was disqualified. And what was interesting, they didn't have to notify you. So your ballot could have been disqualified and you wouldn't even know. So this brings up, what happened in St. Louis City and St. Louis County? What were those election results? How did those mobilizers do? Well, interestingly enough, voter turnout increased by 4.55% in St. Louis County compared to 2016. However, in St. Louis City, voter turnout dropped. And it's important to note that in St. Louis City, Black residents make up 44.9% of the population, as opposed to St. Louis County, where they are 24.3% of the population. So what we're seeing is that the long history of structural barriers that have disenfranchised voters remain a strong determinant factor of voter participation and the concerns of the corporal and cognizant challenges. So what do we need to find out looking at future research? Well, could we find out how many ballots were disqualified, why they were disqualified, and what populations were impacted the most when they were disqualified. I think that's a really interesting area for future research. I want to mention that there are some limitations to this study. We only included the voice of those who were engaged in mobilization efforts. It does not reflect the voice of the voters. Also, every state is different because those laws are different. So they may not be generalizable state to state. I'm going to put a link in the chat. You can actually read. I have 2 articles published on this topic. One is the Corporal and Cognitive Challenges, and another one called Race, Poverty, and Unemployment as Quantitative Predictors of Voter Turnout in St. Louis Amidst COVID-19 and a Renewed Racial Justice Movement. And then I have one that's being considered on how they actually overcame all of those barriers during the election season. And hopefully that will be published soon. And thank you so much. Okay. So are we going? I'm not sure where we're going to, Jason.
Last but not least is Dr. Addie Sandler and Dr. Shannon Lane. They're going to tie us all together.
Great. Thank you, Jason. And thank you. I think this has been, I've just really enjoyed everything that we've talked about so far. And one of the things that Addie and I hope to focus on our part is that there are these big structural issues that people have talked about so eloquently, but that doesn't mean that we can't work both on the micro and the macro level, as Gena talked about at the beginning. So we're going to highlight some work that actually came out of, started with Addie's dissertation work at the University of Connecticut. And so I just want to give you a little bit of an overview as we get started of what her study was. And I think what's going to be interesting is you're going to find, even though we're talking about research that was done in Connecticut, which has some very different voting laws from Missouri, that you're going to see a lot of connections and overlap with things that have been found in other states as well. What Addie did that was really different from what's been done by other folks is that she focused specifically on a population that hasn't been asked about voting in a lot of different ways. And she focused on community college students who received means-tested government assistance. So food stamps, TANF, WIC, that kind of thing. We're going to tell you a little bit about the study today, but if you're interested, we can give you a link to the full article, and the slides will also be available in the Resource Center. So 28 folks who were community college students who got means-tested government assistance participated in this study in the lead up to the 2016 election. So either the fall of 2015 or the beginning of 2016. They participated through a couple of in-person interviews, and they also submitted an electronic survey. And all of that data was collected into NVivo 10 before it was coded. One of the things that's great about this study is that Addie and her collaborator were able to co-code this research to add to the trustworthiness of the study, which most of you probably know is often a challenge in qualitative research. And although this only represents the views of 28 people, we think there's some really good possibility here to understand the motivations of some folks who choose to vote or choose not to vote. And that can help us as individuals when we're working one-on-one with folks and trying to help them access their right to vote. And it can also help us think about how to address some of these structural issues as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Addie for a little bit to talk about what the findings were, and then we're going to discuss what some of the implications are.
Thanks. So what I think was really interesting about the findings is that, well, first of all, the main findings are that from the interviews and the coding process, a pattern began to emerge that there was 4 main categories of voters: dedicated voters, voters, non-voters, and dedicated non-voters. And what made these different from others is that, unlike how political campaigns and literature discusses types of voters, which is based on how frequent people vote in terms of always vote, sometimes vote, never vote. The categories that emerged were based on patterns of the thinking about voting and what went into the thought process of deciding to vote and not vote, and the meaning making about voting. So these 4 categories are not meant to suggest that the traits with each group are exclusive to each group, and they do exist on a continuum. But in general, dedicated voters find voting is important. And that's one of their motivations for voting, which I'll discuss more. Voters aren't really sure, actually, if voting is important. And that's an interesting finding, because we typically think that voters go to vote think it's important. So within this category of voters are people that vote every single election, no matter what, but they are not really sure if it's important, and they may not know who they're voting for before they get to the polling location, which is different than how we normally think of this category of voters. Non-voters don't care about voters. And the last really interesting category, or I think the most interesting category, is dedicated non-voters. We think of people who never vote as being apathetic, or that they don't care, they don't know what's going on. But this category of voters are completely tuned into what's happening in the political world. They understand voting, they know about the candidates, and they make a decision not to vote because they fundamentally believe no matter who wins, it does not matter. The politicians will do whatever they want to, and therefore voting is useless. So Shannon, if you can forward. Thank you. So when we think about the voting process in terms of what's in terms of obstacles to voting, for example, time, long lines, confusion about where to vote, even rain and weather conditions. No matter what the obstacle, those who were identified as being dedicated non-voters, nothing stopped them. They found babysitters. They got to the location because of rain. They stood in line. They did what it had to take. They found ways to overcome any obstacle and voted. Voters, on the other hand, many of them were discouraged if voting was a hassle, if there was bad weather. They could have got, this category was not necessarily was more influenced by the obstacles, so they got discouraged easily. Non-voters, on the other hand, none of these obstacles, these structural barriers, influence them at all. As this participant who I refer to as Joy wrote, I don't vote because I just go about my day. She wasn't even thinking about it. So obstacles did not impact her at all. And lastly, dedicated non-voters, they simply said it does not affect their decision. So a young man I named, referred to as Daryl, says, I just don't feel like it. Voting, I just don't feel like voting is beneficial to me. This young man told a story about how he literally walked his grandmother to a voting location. He was registered, walked her there, stood there while she went and voted. He described how, his grandmother encouraged him, come on in, vote. And he's like, no, I'm not going to vote. It does not matter. So that really exemplifies this dedicated non-voter category of people who just refuse to be part of the process and were resigned that voting does not matter. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So in terms of their perceptions of the political process, dedicated voters trusted in democracy. They trust the process. They trust that elected officials are going to listen to the input of their constituents and will make decisions based on that. And that really motivated them to have this sense they had the sense of responsibility to vote, and they voted strategically. And that was extremely important to them because, again, these were people who were receiving some type of means-tested assistance, and they voted as if their food stamps or their WIC benefits or their TANF depended on their vote. Whereas voters lacked any sense of the actual importance of voting. Voting was not necessarily their first priority, even though many of them did vote, in every opportunity they got. But their voting came in the spirit of voting. These are the ones that talked about, I want to get my I voted sticker, or, everybody's talking about it. Some of these people talked about, figuring out who they were going to be voting as they walked in. Non-voters are what we think of as an apathetic voter. They just don't think about voting. They're not aware of what's going on in the news. And they were just disinterested in general. And lastly, the dedicated non-voter just really lacked all trust in the democratic process and refused to be part of it, out of like the sense of alienation and resignation that their voting was pointless. Okay, Shannon, yeah. And lastly, in thinking about critical awareness in terms of their relationship between electoral politics, policy, and their lives. And to me, this is what got me into this topic. I had worked for a long time in Danbury, Connecticut, working with low-income families. And also I started out as a professor at a community college in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I frequently heard from people, voting doesn't matter. Nobody really understood how voting and politics had anything to do with, for example, SNAP benefits or TANF. So dedicated voters, they did understand these connections, and they voted strategically to protect their self-interest, namely their government assistance. They saw that voting was a resource to impact policy. Voters, on the other hand, really lack this fundamental concept. Their vote is just their vote. I have that in quotes that was said frequently. They looked at voting as voting for a candidate and did not see the connection to how the candidate then would impact the benefits they received. In fact, many people would say, I never even knew it had, when I would ask them in the interviews, how do you see voting as related to your SNAP benefits? And they would say, there is no connection. I don't see that. Non-voters never really thought about their voting at all. Interestingly enough, afterwards, non-voters would frequently, after I turned off the tape recorder, we were walking out of the building and we were saying goodbye, and they would be like, by the way, this was really interesting. Just your questions made me, think maybe there is something to this voting thing. I would love to have followed up with them. Lastly, dedicated non-voters totally understood the relationship between politics, policy, and their lives, but said things like, politicians are just puppets. They're controlled by outside sources. Voting is pointless. One young man said to me, even Obama, I loved Obama, but he didn't call the shots. It was the corporations that caused the shots. And that really reflected what most of the people in this category, how they felt. It didn't really matter, no matter who won. It was just pointless. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So in thinking about how social workers, we can increase informed voting, because that's my passion, is to have informed voting. With dedicated voters, we just need to provide encouragement. They're already gung-ho, know who to vote for, and know how it affects their lives. Voters really need some indirect interventions to help increase their critical awareness about the importance of elections, like nonpartisan information, candidate forums, to really help them, more critically decide whether or not to vote and perhaps who to vote for. Non-voters just need opportunities for critical dialogue about voting and nonpartisan information. I love the Vote ER program that emerged in Boston with doctors who are now talking about voting with their patients. I think that's the perfect example of how to help inform our clients and the people we serve, is just bring it up as part of the culture of our agencies. Just make it part of everyday dialogue that we as social workers have. And lastly, for dedicated non-voters, address the structural issues related to these strong feelings of alienation and resignation, and to create some opportunities for interactions with elected officials, because actually in a lot of ways, these dedicated non-voters are right. And yet they're not voting, continues the cycle. So we need to create opportunities for engagement between elected politicians and dedicated non-voters. And I'll pass it back to Shannon.
Great, thank you. And I think one of the great things about this research is it really highlights something that we know as social workers, right? That we need to start with engaging with people and assessing what they're at and what the challenge is for them, and then we can tailor an intervention to meet that. So we think that social workers and educators and the other folks that we hope were on this meeting today can think about reinforcing with the folks you talk to the connection between the personal and the political and the importance of voting, and talk about the bigger picture of policy, not just individual candidates, because it is hard. I know I saw someone in the chat say sometimes people just don't like either candidate, and that's often the case, but let's talk then about what the bigger policy pictures are. There's often some opportunities for indirect intervention so that we can work on this critical awareness piece, and just dialogue and having the conversations matter. You know, if you're a social worker who's working with survivors of intimate partner violence, you know that it takes more than one conversation to get someone to move to safety. The same thing is true about voting. Sometimes it takes multiple conversations. And lastly, we've got to find good ways, and voting as social work is one, to provide nonpartisan information to folks. And it all comes back to these structural barriers, right? We have to do both, and we can't only talk to individuals and figure out what their motivation is. We can't only address the structural issues. We have to do both at the same time. And to do that, we need all social workers to be on board and commit to working in policy in your states, working in advocacy, and working with the individuals and communities that you know and that trust you in order to change some of this. You know, there's this big picture here of what people need to vote. And as a team, as a group, as a profession, we have the opportunity to make sure that we're providing people with all of these different access, all of these different tools to move them through the program. And as I said, we'll share our slides. And as with everybody else on this call, we are thrilled to talk about this always and forever. So we welcome any thoughts or suggestions or ideas that you have.
Thanks, everybody, so much. We have only 6 minutes left to answer any questions that anybody viewing might have. So if you could put your questions in the chat, we can find somebody to take it up and give you an answer.
I can start with a question that came during Dr. McClendon's section. Let me see. Does this mean that social workers who help clients register to vote are now doing something illegal in Missouri?
So, okay, so it's only about being paid. If you're a paid person and you're helping people register to vote, it's illegal to do that. If you're not being paid, it doesn't matter. But the key word is getting paid for it. So how do you separate that and divide it up? As far as we know, the state hasn't quite figured it out. But if something were to happen, the prosecuting attorney for that particular county would have to decide whether or not they would take up the and prosecute somebody for doing that. But the key word is being paid.
I see Eric Swank, thank you for being here. I see you have a question, which is, can panelists also talk about the links between social change, voting, and things like protesting, doing civil disobedience, boycotts, and strikes? Who wants to start?
Well, I'll try to say something. Well, I'm a big fan of social movements, as I understand the history of social change in this country. Social movements who engage in protests, but lots of other activities, were responsible for most of the progressive legislation between 1935 and 1975, during the period when the welfare state was expanding. They weren't alone, but the politicians and others might not have responded as much as they did, which was never enough, but they might not have responded as much as they did if there wasn't pressure from, as some people say, pressure from below. So I think that's what, if I understood your question, that's what I think you were getting at. So social workers have participated in all those movements, and we participate in local activities, whether they be protests or coalition building or other kinds of things. The idea is to put pressure on the political system to make it move in a direction that you think is important.
Somebody
Thank
else?
you.
Oh, I just wanted to see if somebody else wanted to jump on what Eric's question was before we move forward. No? Laura, you had another question?
Yes, for Dr. Lane and Dr. Sandler, they were wondering, was the question asked to committed non-governmental, what would make them want to vote? If you asked that, what was the response?
So am I understanding that the question is whether or not in the data collection, the dedicated non-voters were asked, what would make you vote?
Yes, I think that's what's being asked, yes.
Well, I didn't actually necessarily pose that to them. I didn't have to. These particular group of people were not going to vote. The example I gave of the young man who walked his grandmother to the firehouse and waited while she voted was very active at that time in the Black Lives Movement, which was occurring in Hartford. And so he just fundamentally was not going to vote. He really saw it as an act of political protest by not voting.
And we have had several requests for resources, just to let our guests know that all of our fantastic panelists are going to send me these slides that they shared with you today, and we will have them posted. I'll put the link in the chat in just a moment, but we will have those posted on the Open Classroom webinar. Please be patient with us. It'll take a few days perhaps to get these posted and approved, but they will be there for you, and as well as a recording of this program. We've got a question.
Laurie, can I just jump in
Yes,
for a second?
please, absolutely.
For the panelists, Jennifer Johnson wants to know if there's any statewide resource list that the folks could offer. I'm thinking like League of Women Voters, NAACP. I didn't know if you guys could think of any other organizations that have any resources that folks in specific states could reach and access.
I mean, I think somebody else just suggested the ACLU. Go ahead, Gena, sorry.
Yeah, and then in Missouri, there's an organization called Missouri Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice. They do a lot around democracy and voting. And then in Missouri, we actually have a statewide coalition called the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition. They don't have a webpage, but if you're interested in joining the weekly calls, I will, and you're from Missouri, I will put my email address in the chat and then connect you that way.
I just wanted to piggyback on that and say it really is important. I'm so glad she asked that question. Having state level resources is really important because the voting laws are so different state to state. And I think particularly if you're working with folks who maybe have criminal justice involvement or in other ways that getting involved in voting could be, there could be a potential that it's problematic for folks. So I think we all have resources in our states, but we're also voting as social work, and all of us are happy to help connect you. I know Suzanne Pritzker is doing great things at the University of Houston around Texas. There's social workers all over doing this work. And if you want to be connected to that network, or you're in that network and you want us to share your stuff with other people, please let us know, and we're happy to do that.
Also, if I could just add one more thing, I'm plugging our website, not because I work on it, but because it answers some of these questions. We have, I believe on the website, there's information, state level information about what the rules are. Some of the things that have just been referenced, I think there were documents that describe what's going on in what's possible in each state. Also, someone asked, does anyone have any material that discusses the question of why vote? And one of the first webinars Voting as Social Work did was a why vote. It was a campaign. It explains why vote, and it also has a campaign, details of a campaign that one can do in a community or on campus. So just if you go to our website and look for why votes, and it was done by an organization called Speak, where Rick Hofer was on the faculty there. So it's a really wonderful, detailed, step-by-step calendared process that you could do on a campus or in other venues.
And I'm afraid we are so far out of time. So Jason, I will let you say goodbye to our guests and a huge thank you to our panelists. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions, but we do thank you for your interest and your curiosity and for spreading the word about voting as social work.
What she said. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for a great conversation and presentation of your research. Hopefully we'll continue this conversation and keep spreading this information and helping get people what they need so we can get more and more people to the polls to actually have their voice heard.